I've been using biblical stories. The Israelites go to Moses and they say, look, we're thirsting for water. We're going to die. Do you think you can have a chat with God? Instead of asking the rocks, he hits them twice with the staff. So he forces them. And God tells them that in consequence of that, number one, he's going to die. And number two, he's not going to get to the promised land. Right. In the Gospels, of course, Christ forgoes power altogether. And that's right. It's right.
That to me is one of the most fascinating aspects of Christianity. That if you follow the principles, it's incredibly beneficial. There's truth in it.
They're true always.
Jordan Peterson was on Joe Rogan's podcast again, and let me tell you, this one is absolutely amazing. Joe Rogan has recently been talking to a lot of Christians, recently with West Huff, and now Joe Rogan brings up how they think it is true. Absolutely fascinating. So we start off with Jordan Peterson telling a Bible story, and it's phenomenal. Let's get into it.
And one rule is you don't use force or fear, right? Use invitation. So can I tell you a story about that?
Please do.
Here's the Bible story.
Okay, so I've been touring about this new book of mine, right? We Who Wrestle with God, and it's I've been lecturing about lots of the things I know, but I've been using biblical stories mostly to provide an analytical frame, because that's what stories do. They provide a frame. And there's a great story in the continuing Exodus story, the story of Moses and the Israelites, where Moses has led his people away from the tyrant and away from their own slavery, because there's a dynamic in that story between those two things. No tyrants without slaves. Or you might say no tyrants without willing slaves. And so the Israelites have to get away from the tyrant, but then it's across the Red Sea of chaos and blood and into the desert for 40 years. You don't escape from the tyrant if you're a slave without paying a price, and maybe for 3 generations. It's rough. So Moses is trying to get these people to stop being slaves and to take responsibility so they don't need a tyrant. And so he's kind of got there, and they're on the edge of the promised land, right? And so they're almost at the end of their voyage, and they run out of water. They're still in the desert. They run out of water, and they get all whiny and about the fact that they had to go across the desert and that it was way...
I love how he always uses that analogy when he talks about the Israelites in the wilderness. It's hilarious.
Under the tyrant, and that Moses is nothing but a corrupt patriarch, and he's only power mad, and they foment some rebellion. And anyways, it's a pretty ugly situation. And the Israelites go to Moses and they say, look, we're really starving. We're thirsting for water. We're going to die. Do you think you can have a chat with God, see if he'll do something about this? And God tells Moses to go to some rocks in the desert and to ask them to bring water forth. And so he goes with his people to these rocks, and instead of asking, he takes this staff of his. This staff is a really important thing. It's like your staff if you have an organization, same derivation. But it's also the magic wand of Gandalf. It's the flag you plant in new territory. It's the tree of life. It's the living tradition that has a spirit inside it, and that's a serpent, and that's the serpent that eats all the serpents of the Egyptian tyrants, magicians. That's the staff. It's his rod of his authority. And he, instead of asking the rocks, he hits them twice with the staff. So he forces them. And God tells him that in consequence of that, number one, he's going to die. And number two, he's not going to get to the promised land.
Wow.
Right. So there's this insistence. It's really...
I love Joe Rogan's face. He's just like, shh. I remember speaking about this, and he missed out on an opportunity to experience God in a whole new way. Because this is the second time, actually, God told Moses to get water from a rock. The first time, God told Moses to strike the rock and the water came out. This time, God told Moses to speak to the rock. And I love the analogy that he used to, force and fear. But a lot of times we think that we can do it on our own. By Moses striking the rock, it was showing that he's the one who's the source of water instead of God. That's taking away glory from God. That's something that I've learned.
Well, it's a crucial insistence, and it's very important in this time, I think, to understand what this means. So Moses is a leader. He's the archetypal leader, and he realizes his responsibility in the encounter with the burning bush, which is something that attracts his attention, that he takes with great seriousness, and that transforms him. And so then he becomes the leader who stands up against the tyrant and frees the slaves and takes them through chaos into the desert. And his temptation as leader is to use force. So when he's a young man, for example, he kills an Egyptian aristocrat who was tormenting a Hebrew slave, and that's why he has to leave Egypt. He's tempted by power because he's a leader. And then at the end, even though he's done all these things, he's been an upstanding man and gone beyond his call of duty. And he's right at the point where he attains victory, right, to enter the promised land. And he uses force once. When God tells him to use invitation, to use his words, the logos, to use words, to use invitation. And that's enough so that he's dead. So is his brother Aaron. That's his political arm. And he doesn't enter the promised land. And then in the Gospels, of course, Christ forgoes power altogether. The temptation in the desert, one of the three temptations is the temptation for use of power. So one of the things that maybe we could conclude from all this, given the context of what you said, is that you can tell the tyrants, they use fear and compulsion, and they don't use invitation. So one of the rules we put together for ARC was invitation only. Play, we're going to do this playfully, and we're not going to use force or fear, ever.
How Jesus actually resisted temptation and he laid down his fleshly desires. So now we're going to move forward to where they talk about the biblical truths and how they are all applicable for us today. Absolutely amazing. Get ready, guys. Buckle your seatbelts because this one is going to be wild.
And the best part of the cut, and he offers that to God. So he literally brings his best to the table. That's what he sacrifices. And Cain doesn't. So Cain's sacrifices are rejected by God. And God tells him, if you brought your best to the table, you'd be accepted. And Cain gets bitter and resentful and invites temptation in to possess him. So that spirit of resentment possesses him, and then he becomes murderous. He kills his brother, and his descendants become genocidal, and then you have the flood. And so that pattern of sacrifice is established right at the beginning of the biblical texts. Abel versus Cain. Abel brings the best to the table, and that satisfies God. So one question. God actually asks Cain this when Cain complains. He says, wouldn't you be accepted if you were doing your best? And so that's a question of conscience, right? If you're in extreme misery and your life is hollow and empty and you're bitter and resentful, it's like, you bringing your best to the table? Because the covenant proclaims that if you did, you'd be accepted.
Yeah.
So
Clearly.
Okay, so now the question is, what constitutes, now you have to sacrifice. So sacrifice becomes the foundation of the state, not power, not hedonism, it's sacrifice. And then that motif is played out through the whole Bible, and that's what culminates in the New Testament.
Oh, boy.
Right? Total sacrifice as the foundation of the community. And that's right. And I don't know what sense to make out of the metaphysics of the religious realm, because that's beyond me and everyone. The world's a strange place, and we could leave it at that. But the idea that, see, Christ is the exemplar of voluntary self-sacrifice, right? Won't turn to power, won't deviate from his course, faces the worst of all possible deaths, descends to hell itself. That's the pattern of life lived with no reserve. And that's the foundation of the free state. That's right. I tried that on Brett, eh? He told me when we first met on the tour that he felt that the biblical narratives were anachronistic, that they were written in a time that was no longer relevant to us. But he decided by the end of our 3 days together that if you got to the core of the message, it's alive, right? That's the living spirit inside the bush, you might say.
Right.
And that so here's even the weirder thing. So imagine, it's pretty obvious that Christ is a symbol of voluntary self-sacrifice, right? I don't think that doesn't really come as a shock to anyone. But the weird thing is, we put that symbol at the center of our churches and at the centers of our towns for 2,000 years, not really knowing why. And the reason is that voluntary self-sacrifice is the foundation of the integrated psyche and the stable, productive, and abundant community. And that's right. It's right. And so
So it was right all along. God has called us to all lay our life down and to sacrifice ourselves. Romans 12 says, finally, brothers and sisters, in whatever you do, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true and proper worship.
Well, it's been exciting to have the opportunity over the last 9 months to go talk to people about that, because I've talked to about 150,000 people, I guess, public lectures.
That to me is one of the most fascinating aspects of Christianity, regardless of whether or not you think logically these things took place. Logically, these stories are a completely accurate depiction of exactly how it went. If you follow the principles, it's incredibly beneficial to your spiritual life as a person. Like
Let's go. That's absolutely amazing. Imagine him saying, if you follow the principle of the Bible, it will drastically cause you to be a spiritually better person. He says spiritually.
It's a kind of interesting proof, isn't it? Because it means that
there's truth in it.
Well, there's certainly the spirit that makes, what would you say? The spirit of truth that makes life more abundant. That's exactly right. And these are weird stories because the way they're true is very sophisticated. They're true always. And that's different than a story about the past. Like the truest story is always happening. The story of Moses is exactly like that. Like the pattern of leadership development that's embedded in the Exodus story, that is how leaders develop, if they're real leaders. And their temptation is power, but that's not their motivation. That's their temptation, right? That's a very important distinction. And that's always the case with leaders. And if they fall prey to the temptation of power, no matter what their accomplishments, they're not going to complete the task.
Right.
And so there's a cool element at the end of that story too. You know, when Moses, just before Moses dies, he picks a scout from each tribe, 12 tribes, and he sends them to Canaan, which is the future. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's the potential place we could reside where everything was worked out, the land of milk and honey. He sends 12 scouts there. And 10 of them come back and say, they tell a fear story. Say it's insurmountable, the challenges that lie ahead of us. There's no way we can master this. We should have never crossed the desert. We should have stayed under the thumbs of the tyrants. We should have never tried to be anything more than slaves, because now we're doomed. And 2 of them say, no, if we maintain our upward orientation and our covenant, nothing can stand in our way. We can make the deserts bloom. Moses dies, those 2 scouts, and so do all the Israelites who are convinced by the unfaithful scouts. And the scouts die, and the 2 people who go on to the promised land are Caleb and Joshua. And they lead the Israelites, the faithful Israelites, into the promised land. Those are the people who have the courage to confront the future in a faithful and, what would you say, faithful, hopeful, and courageous manner. They're the inherit.
Looking at it like that, but without the God aspect, obviously. But those are the people who trusted in God. They stopped relying on their own strength. They looked at the giants, they looked at all the terrible things, but they knew that they had a God that was bigger than all of that.
Of the future. Caleb, Joshua. Joshua's name is the same as Christ's name.
Yep.
It's the same name. And that's not fluke, right? That's one of those echoes or precursors to the story. There's an ethos that leads you into the promised land. And what's the ethos? The spirit of voluntary self-sacrifice. You know, you give up something for a social relationship. Of course, you give up being primary, right? You do the same thing at the social level. And when you do that, it integrates you and it sets the world straight. And that's built into the biblical story. It's right at its core.
Wow.
So it's great fun to explain these things to people on the tour because it sorts them out.
Well, it's very fascinating.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And the fact that these stories have existed for so long is so interesting. You know, that's where it gets really weird.
Yeah. Well, they've adapted to the contours of our memory and our imagination.
Yeah.
So you find them compelling and they stick to your memory. So I'm going to tell you what else
Well, that's absolutely awesome. You heard Joe Rogan's just seemingly talking more and more positive about Christianity. He even said it's seemingly is true to the spiritual level, like at the end of the day. So guys, I really encourage you all to seek Jesus, and if you're doubting, if you have any thoughts of just insecurities or whatever, I encourage you to give it to Jesus and to sacrifice yourself and go to God. In the description below, you will be able to click a link to help you to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. Do that today.